The Parsha is Parshat Pekudei, and we reach the end of the book of Exodus. And I had to note to myself that the very last section of the book of Exodus is what I read as my maftir at my bar mitzvah. So I couldn't resist commenting on that. This Exodus 40, verses 34 to 38, the very last verses of the book of Exodus, depicts the moment when Moses completes the work of building the tabernacle. The work is completely finished. In fact, the text actually says, Vayachal Moshe et hamalacha. Vayachal Moshe et hamalacha. It is so reminiscent of the section in the Torah in Genesis 2, which we sang not long ago, about the completion of creation. Vayachal Elohim beyom hashvi'i melachto asher asa. Vayachal Elohim melachto. God completed the work of creation in Genesis 2. And here, Vayachal Moshe et hamalacha. Moses completed the work.
Okay, we missed the
So it is that the tabernacle is sometimes presented as a microcosm of the world. The section reads, then the cloud covered the tent of meeting, and the presence of the Eternal filled the tabernacle. Moses was not able to enter into the tent of meeting because the cloud abode upon it, and the presence of the Eternal filled the tabernacle. Whenever the cloud was taken up from over the tabernacle, the children of Israel went onward throughout all their journeys. But if the cloud was not taken up, then they did not journey until the day it was taken up. For the cloud of the Eternal was over the tabernacle by day, and there was fire in it by night, in the sight of all the house of Israel, throughout all their journeys. I didn't necessarily appreciate that section when I read it as a young bar mitzvah, but as an adult, when I looked at that again, what a section to be reading on your bar mitzvah. In this little section of Torah at the end of the book of Exodus, the tabernacle, or the Mishkan, from the word Shekhinah, or presence, is completed. The place of presence is completed. This tabernacle is the communal focal point of God's presence. The people themselves have created this tabernacle, this focal point of God's presence, as God has commanded. The creation of the tabernacle itself is done by the people of Israel in partnership with God. Now that it is complete, the presence of God is sensed within the structure which the people have built. Just as the people heard and came to understand in an earlier section of the Torah, in an earlier section of Exodus, in Parshat Truma, in Exodus 25, God says, Va'asuli mikdash v'shachanti b'tocham. They shall build me a sanctuary. They shall build me a holy place, and I shall dwell amongst them. And so now here, the people have built the sanctuary, and now the people sense the divine presence among them. And they perceive guidance and direction. For this legacy goes with them everywhere in their journeys. It is a pillar of cloud for them by day and a pillar of fire by night, letting them know how to direct themselves, letting them know where to go, and letting them know that they are not alone. A question from this arises for us: how do we as a people take this legacy from Sinai? How do we take this legacy with us into the future throughout all our journeys? How do we let this heritage travel with us? How do we bring this heritage within us? How do we live as, in the words of the Torah, as a kingdom of priests and a holy nation from here going forward, as individuals and as a community. And maybe even not, certainly not only as individuals, but indeed as a community. For if it were up to each of us alone as individuals, it might be too much. But as a community, we can strive together. But as a community, where is our pillar of cloud by day and our pillar of fire by night leading us along? To explore this, I suggest we look at what took over the function of the tabernacle as time went on. The place and role of the tabernacle in Jewish life eventually becomes the place and role of the temple in Jerusalem. The temple becomes a communal focal point for our people. And then after the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem, the place and role of the tabernacle is taken up by the liturgical life of the entire people. The liturgy, the prayers, the structure of the prayers, the liturgical life of the people replaces the role of the priests in the temple. The Amidah, which we recite, the Amidah is recited at the timing of the sacrifices. At the timing of the sacrifices, the morning Amidah, the Shacharit Amidah, is in place of the Shacharit sacrifice. The Mincha Amidah, the afternoon Amidah, is in place of the Mincha sacrifice, the afternoon sacrifice. The evening Amidah is in place of the fire that burned through the night. Wasn't an actual extra sacrifice, and that is why traditionally that Amidah is not said out loud, but only silently. The specifics of the prayers and the rituals we perform have been evolving through our history. These prayers were taking shape in the time of the temple in Jerusalem. It may be that this Amidah we recite is not only something that comes to being after the destruction of the temple, but existed in the midst of that time, because most of the people, when the temple stood, weren't in Jerusalem, but they could say these prayers at the same time of the sacrifices being offered in Jerusalem. And everybody contributed this half shekel so that everybody was sustaining and participating in that sacrifice in Jerusalem. These prayers continue to take shape after the destruction of the temple by the Romans in 70 CE. In the 9th century, authorities in the Jewish community of Spain asked authorities in the Jewish academies near Baghdad for a written manual of that prayer structure as it was being lived out in Babylon. Imagine this for a moment. The Jewish community in Spain. Spain is far in the west. Spain, at that time, it's the edge of the world. It's the end of the world. You've got Jews in the end of the world. This is Yenemsveld. The Jewish community in Spain writes to the Jewish community, the Jewish academies, the leading academies, which were all in the center of the Islamic Empire in Baghdad. They want a write-out. What are the prayers that you are saying in the academies? This led to the creation of what becomes a written siddur, or arrangement of prayers. Since then, the siddur, or prayer book, has served as a manual for building this liturgical structure, this prayer structure in the life of the people. Flowing from this, wherever Jewish liturgy was practiced, most often the synagogue in the home, that place came to hold a little bit of the sanctity of the temple in the eyes of tradition. Synagogues are sometimes called a mikdash ma'at, or a little sanctuary. One rabbinic teaching describes how the Shabbat table, where we say Kiddush and Motzi, is raised to the level of the altar. That's why the challah in the altar is like the showbread. The challah on the table of Shabbat is like the showbread at the altar. The tradition of putting salt on the challah comes from the tradition of putting salt on the sacrifice. So when we have a Shabbat meal, we are raising our table to the level of an altar. Another midrash depicts how when the temple in Jerusalem was destroyed, stones from the temple were scattered throughout the world. And wherever a stone landed, there later a synagogue was built. Of course, the sociological and historical truth is not that far off. It's that the Jewish people were scattered, and wherever a Jewish community landed, there the people established their liturgical practice, and then a synagogue was built, as we know firsthand. The liturgical structure we as a people built and build in our lives has become like the mikdash, the sanctuary, that we build so that the divine presence may dwell among us. We have used the God-given power, the life force that runs through us, to build a sanctuary in the wilderness, and then a temple in Jerusalem, and then a liturgical structure wherever we are, so that God would dwell in our midst. Vasuli mikdash v'shachanti betocham. Let them build me a sanctuary, and I will dwell among them. How then do we derive guidance or find direction through this structure, like those pillars of cloud and pillars of fire? I briefly had a friend before he died years ago, Rabbi Seth Brody, who, when I knew him, was working on his dissertation that he titled, "Human Hands Dwell in Heavenly Heights." Human hands dwell in heavenly heights. He was writing about 13th century Kabbalists. He wrote about prayer and dveikut, connection, mystical connection between us and the divine. He wrote that in the view of some 13th century Kabbalists, the power of prayer was connected to the dveikut, the mystical connection it provoked. It was his contention that in 13th century Spanish Kabbalah, the power of prayer was seen not in the prayer itself, but in the consciousness of the prayer. The power of prayer was not in the prayer, but in the prayer, in the consciousness of the praying person. To use their metaphor, as they described it, it was as if the spiritual state of the person who prayed enabled that soul, his or her soul, to touch the heavenly heights, as a result of which blessings would be shaken loose and would rain down upon the human realm. Contemplation then would lead to a union of the soul with the divine that allows some of the godly abundance to descend to this plane. In our perspective and in our intellectual context, we would say prayer has a transformative effect on the consciousness of the person who prays. We strive to allow our hearts to be shaped by this encounter of prayer, especially if we are in a habit of praying. So our hearts are continuously reinforced and shaped. After engaging in prayer, we then can give ourselves room to voice the divinity that has been impressed upon our own hearts. As we read in the Shema, you shall love the Lord your God with all of your heart, with all of your soul, with all of your might. And these words which I command you this day shall be on your heart. So to paraphrase that slightly, you shall connect to Adonai your God with all of your heart and mind, and with all of your body and soul, and with all of your impact. And then these words that I command you this day shall appear upon your heart. They shall be upon your heart. So let me say that again. You shall connect to God with all of your heart, body, mind, and soul. And these words which I command you today will appear on your heart. When we, together as a people, wherever we are, engage in this prayer structure as laid out in the Siddur, we are constituting ourselves again as a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. When we read Torah as a community, it is as if we are again standing at Sinai, hearing the words of Torah. When we study Torah, we are again standing at Sinai, understanding words of Torah. When we recite the Kedusha, Kadosh, 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 it literally says, we praise God as they do in heavens, in the heights above. We recite the Kedusha, we are uniting the worlds above and with the worlds below, or in a different set of metaphors, we are uniting the world within us with the world around us. When we as a people live out this prayer structure, we are at that moment reestablishing the structure through which God's presence is felt among us. We are encountering the words with our heart. We are carving the words of Torah upon our hearts, shaping our hearts, so that when we check in again with our hearts, Torah will be there. Jewish mystics speak of uniting Malchut, kingship, or Shekhinah, or presence. They speak of uniting Shekhinah, presence, with the Holy Blessed One through some form of sacred act. That, it seems to me, means allowing the divine presence to be felt in the world. Jewish thought insists that the divine presence exists at all times, but it is not always felt in the world at all times. When we as a people create a structure through which the divine presence is felt in our hearts and then felt in the world, then we have united the Holy Blessed One with the Shekhinah. The Siddur itself here has the potential to play a key role as a spiritual tool by which we as a people bring ourselves together wherever we are scattered. We bring ourselves together into one collective. This collective is infused by these sacred values of our heritage, all of which focus on Shalom. As you'll notice in the Amidah, in the Siddur, every Amidah ends with a blessing for Shalom, which ultimately is harmony, unity, peace, the peaceful coexistence of all parts of the world. This is a key value to everything that is Jewish. We are not Israel unless we are a people of goodness, blessing, grace, compassion, justice, righteousness, loving kindness, and shalom. Bracha, chen, chaim, chen, v'chesed, v'rachamim, chaim, v'shalom. The Siddur helps us become this. The Siddur helps constitute and sustain us as a people, projecting into the world the teachings of Torah and Shalom. And certainly now more than ever, the world needs more Shalom. Which brings us to Shabbat Shalom. Shabbat Shalom. But before I conclude my comments, I want to recite the very last part of the book of Exodus, where when we finish a book, we say Chazak. When we finish a book, we rise, and we say Chazak, Chazak, v'nit chazek, strength, strength, and be strengthened. I already read the section in English. It is about the cloud the tabernacle being built in the cloud setting down upon the tabernacle, cloud, a pillar of cloud in day and a pillar of fire by night. Over the tabernacle, a cloud of the Lord rested by day, and a fire would appear in it by night, in the view of all the house of Israel throughout their journeys. ויחס הענן את אוהל מועד, וכבוד אדוני מלא את המשכן, ולא יכול משה לבוא אל אוהל מועד, כי שכן עליו הענן, וכבוד אדוני מלא את המשכן, ובהעלות הענן מעל המשכן, ייסעו בני ישראל בכל מעשיהם, ואם לא יעלה הענן ולא ייסעו עד יום העלותו, כי ענן אדוני על המשכן יומם, ואש תהיה לילה בו לעיני כל בית ישראל בכל מעשיהם. חזק חזק ונתחזק. Shabbat Shalom.